Hi, everybody. What's going on? I'm DJ Sixsmith. Welcome to Sit Down. It's a pleasure today to talk to Steve Kroft. Barack Obama, the 60-minute interviews. It is on Simon Schuster Audio. Steve, how are you?
I'm doing good, DJ. Yourself? How are things in Chicago?
Everything is good on my end. Can't complain. And honestly, it's a crazy time. It's a scary time in a lot of ways, but we need stuff to read. We need stuff to listen to, and maybe a different administration to think about as well. And you spent so much time with President Obama. 17 interviews. What was it like to relive it through an audiobook here?
Well, I got this call from Simon and Schuster. Actually, the first one a couple of years ago, talking about a project of taking all of the interviews, or 17 interviews I did with Obama for 60 minutes between January of 2007 and December of January of 2016. And stringing them together, unedited, in consecutive order, and they wanted me to write and record some narrations that held them all together and gave context to the interviews in the sense of what was going on at the time that we did them, and what had happened since the last interview, all that sort of stuff. And I was a little skeptical at first. I just didn't know how many people would be interested in it. Mostly I was worried about how dated the interviews might be. They kept saying, no, we've listened to them. They're great. They sent me a copy of the transcripts. And I have to say, I was really surprised how relevant they still are today and in many different ways, particularly at a time when leadership in the White House is something that's on everybody's mind.
I think it's really fascinating to revisit, especially more than a decade later, and also just the evolution of President Obama from a senator when you first interviewed him to a two-term president at the end. So what was most striking about hearing the differences between Senator Obama and then President Obama at the end of the second term?
I have to say, in many ways, they're still the same. They were still the same person, but he changed a lot. When I first met him in January of 2007, it was the week before he announced his candidacy. And he was known mostly for a speech he'd given at a Democratic convention years ago. He was very charismatic, very accomplished, but he had almost no political experience at the national level. A year as a freshman senator. Everything else was in the Illinois legislature, which I don't want to play down, but it's not exactly a stepping stone to the White House for anybody but Abe Lincoln. And we wanted to see what he was like, what the substance was. We knew he was an attractive candidate, and we had to see in the initial interviews if he measured up, if he was just, I called him the bright, shiny object. He was the thing all the reporters and everybody was drawn to in the campaign, because all the other faces were familiar Democratic faces, and Hillary Clinton was going to win the nomination anyway. And we wanted to see whether he had tremendous potential. We wanted to see if his capabilities met his ambitions.
What was the biggest challenge in interviewing President Obama so many different times?
There weren't very many challenges. It was really pretty smooth. We had no idea when we first met that we would end up doing 17 of these interviews. They just sort of developed one at a time. The first one went well. And I was sort of covering for 60 minutes the Democratic candidates, and Scott Pelley was covering the Republican candidates. And I kept doing the interviews through the election. And then when he got elected, I just stayed on and did it. And you mentioned the evolution. That's the interesting thing. It's the interesting thing about the interviews and the tape, because you can see him change. You can see the gradual changes, and they are very gradual changes. But you see him developing from a very unlikely presidential candidate to a world leader, one of the most powerful people in the world, in the space of a year, facing some really incredible challenges. One of the things that surprised me most, and I kind of forgotten, I remember everything, but sometimes the time frame in which they occurred is a little muddled. But I was really kind of surprised. First of all, I was surprised he ever won. That was the first thing when I was listening to them. Because you forget how improbable it was at the very beginning. The other thing is how quickly he was consumed by this financial crisis in 2008, which didn't happen while he was in office. It happened when he was running against John McCain. By the time he was inaugurated, a lot of the big decisions had already been made by the outgoing Bush administration, and he was just sort of saddled with a very different kind of country that he had it was talking about when he was running his campaign. And there were, a lot of things that happened during his term. I mean, from the primary battle to the election reform, to trying to decide whether to save the automobile industry or not, to push healthcare reform through at a time when financial crisis was still full blown, and he had no support on the Republican side at all. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a lot going on. And you just kind of see him turn into the president that he became, in his own words, step by step.
I think one of the coolest things about this audiobook is that it's really this living, breathing digital document in a sense. And you mentioned how contentious the 2008 election was with John McCain, but you also mentioned the fact that the buildup with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, it was supposed to be Hillary Clinton, according to a lot of people. And then she comes and works in the Obama administration as Secretary of State, and she gets involved here later in one of the interviews. So what do you remember about just the rapport between President Obama and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton?
Very, very complicated relationship. They did not like each other when they were running against each other, as most people don't. But it was, I think it was personal at some level. They told me later that most of the animosity was between their spouses and not between them personally. But, once the election happened and once the Clintons came on board, which was really a crucial step for him in the general election, because I think McCain at the beginning was still a pretty strong favorite. And he got them on board and decided to utilize her talents. And then I think they became allies. It's difficult to tell with politicians how close they really were, but in the interview that we did with them jointly, which was right after Benghazi, it was months after Benghazi, they were very complimentary of each other. And the point of that interview with Clinton was really, most people forget it, it was a political interview. And Obama really decided during that interview and came out and really made it pretty clear that he favored Senator Clinton over Joe Biden.
Well, why don't we talk? Yeah, well, why don't we talk about Joe Biden? Because at the time, he is the right-hand man to Barack Obama as his vice president. Many people thought that was the end of his political life, and then things changed, and now here he is as the nominee. So what was it like just seeing the two of them together? And, what do you make of the fact that, we're a couple of weeks away from potentially a Joe Biden presidency here starting in 2021?
Well, I think the Biden-Obama relationship was very close. I think he had a tremendous amount of respect for Biden. I think that he felt that it would be taking on too much for Joe Biden to run for president following the loss of his son. And I think that he thought also probably that he owed Hillary Clinton for his support, which helped him get elected not once, but twice, and her husband. But, a lot of water's gone under the bridge since then. I haven't seen Joe Biden in a while other than on TV. But it's it's really an interesting race. And, you talk about, I mentioned Trump earlier, the differences in the political leadership. It would just almost impossible to enumerate the differences between President Obama and President Trump. In fact, it's almost impossible to find any similarities, at least in the style and the way they govern, and particularly in their temperaments. President Obama was always very well informed, did his homework every night. On the weekends, he knew as much about these things as his advisors did, and he was very cautious in his approach. And Trump is, just the opposite, and that's not taking away from him credit that President Obama gave him in the last interview. that he was able to tap into things in the United States and attract people who felt that they had been aggrieved, a lot of them in the Midwest and in your state. So he has done some things that have pleased a lot of people, but their style is completely different. Their view of the Constitution and law and order are different. One is very disruptive and the other is very traditional.
Yeah, not too many similarities there, but it's really fascinating how some voters went from President Obama to President Trump from one election to the next. And I think it's really interesting, Steve, because you did all these great interviews with President Obama, but you had such an extraordinary career at 60 Minutes too, and all the work you did. What are you most proud of when you think back on your career?
I think the fact that I was there for 30 years. It was a tough place. It's a tough job, really exhausting in lots of ways, lots of travel. And I have to say, I don't miss it. This is the first time in 50 years since I first got in the business that I don't have any deadlines and don't feel the pressure. And it's a huge relief. I don't miss it, particularly given the state of the world right now. But I'd say the fact that I was there, for 30 years, the Obama interviews, clearly the interview I did with President Obama or with Governor Clinton and Hillary Clinton when he was first running for office around the Jennifer Flowers affair. But also, I did 500 stories. There are just too many, but to try and single out a few. But I was fortunate enough to have won a lot of awards, and generally speaking, the ones that I won awards for were the ones that I'm the most proud of.
Do you have a favorite Mike Wallace story of working with him?
I'm not sure I can tell it. I do have a favorite story, but I can't tell it. Not even on the internet. He was a great guy. I grew up with him. I mean, I was 5 or 6 years old when my mother's favorite show on television was a show being done out of Chicago called the Mike and Buff Show. You're way too young to remember that. But he had, well, I can tell this story. They got called to New York by Metro Media, and they said, we want to syndicate your show nationally. And they told me, says, we just decided to get a divorce. A couple of weeks ago, things weren't going well. The pressures of doing this show or getting to our marriage is ruining the marriage. And then I think their agents got involved and convinced them that they shouldn't get a divorce and stay together. That sums up Mike pretty well. He was always incredibly ambitious. I just saw online an interview that Mike did with Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, back in the early 60s. I mean, he just was interviewing so many famous people, and talk about somebody who had experienced a half a century of living at the highest level. That was Mike. And he was a great guy.
Well, I appreciate that story, and I appreciate the time. Steve, really nice to talk to you. Thanks so much, and stay healthy, all right?
Okay, take it easy, DA.